So the reason that's just about is because I'm leaving.
Oh,
that's okay, they know that. So hello everybody, as mentioned, I'm Jonathan, and my normal job, as indicated by Alex there, is I work in IT security. But in my spare time, I'm a developer. So I get to play with other bits and pieces. And that's why I'm talking about software testing, because it's something I've dabbled with. But just to caveat that, I'm not an expert on software testing. There are people in the room, and I can see some of them, are more expert at this than I am. So hopefully they've got like nice soft tomatoes to throw, and not tinned ones. So that's where we're coming from. There might be some questions that you have that I can't answer, but I'm sure I can point you someone that does. If you've been looking at the Code Harbour archive, you'll see that some people have done talks on software testing before. Glenn's done one, and Nick Ellis did one. He's not here this evening. So do go back and have a look at those as well. We do cover different things, so you're not going to hear the same thing again. So you might think, why do you bother testing the software? And certainly some companies only seem to test it in production when the end user gets hold of it and, oh, it doesn't work. It doesn't add anything to the functionality. You don't get an end user sitting there, you know what, I really fancy a test for this. So we're going to have a look at some of the reasons that you might do some tests. So first of all, the bit that I'm interested in, the functional test. They check that the code is going to do what you wanted it to do. It sounds obvious, but your other option is not knowing and shipping it anyway. SolarWinds, I'm looking at you. It can check that you've built the right thing. Maybe it looks at the specification that you've got from your client, and you can sit there and marry those two up. Importantly, and I've been bitten by this, if you make a change in your application, you might be changing something over there. Something over there might break. And you might think they're totally unrelated because you've forgotten something or somebody else did it. Your tests can help show if you've broken something. And it will also help you find security issues. And yeah, I speak from experience on that one, which is a little embarrassing being a security guy, but that's the prime example I've got in this slide deck later on. So the problem is that testing by hand takes time. And I started out like this, didn't know any better. I'd write a piece of an application, I'd click some buttons, it did what I wanted, I'd move on to the next bit. Works fine if your application's 5 pages long perhaps, but as your application gets bigger, the amount of time it takes you to test gets longer. But it doesn't scale because of that reason. Because every time you make a change, you've got to test it again. And it might be that you've just changed, I don't know, a little bit of JavaScript over there, changes an option on the page. Should be fine, might not be. So as a result of that, testing with automated systems is really, really handy and saves a buttload of time. Equally, there is still a space for getting an end user or a human to test it. You might want to check that it lines up properly, or that it looks good, or there isn't a contrast issue. So getting the end user acceptance is still good. But for most of the work that I'm doing, I've got to start with the automated stuff, because I don't want to have to sit a user down every 5 minutes. So automated tests are a solution. As you can see, there's quite a few different types of tests. Glenn talked about some of these previously. So static analysis, the code isn't running, your tools are just looking at it. Dynamic analysis, which is the sort of stuff that I'm looking at. The code runs, your test looks to check, is this doing what it should do? And that's where my functional tests are coming in. They're dynamic. They want to see what the code has done, and they can check some rules essentially and make sure that works. And there's different testing tools that will tie into that. So PHP stand, for example, does your static analysis. It will look and just check some rules have been met. Maybe the code smells, which seems to be what PHP Storm calls it. Codeception, which is something that I use, does the dynamic analysis. And the examples I'll show in a bit are codeception based. So it runs the code and says, okay, go to this page, do this thing. And that's what I'll show you in a bit. And then, because there's many, many different languages and many different test frameworks, you've got things like JUnit for testing in Java, not JavaScript. So some frameworks. You've got PyTest for Python, JUnit5 for Java, PHP Unit speaks for itself, Catch Squared, well that's C++ type stuff. I had to Google for some of these because some of those languages I don't use. But the point I'm trying to make here is that if there's a language that you like, there's probably a test framework for it. So it's just a case of going and finding one. There might be multiple. Find something that you like. Find one that you can cope with, and then go from there. And it's worth investing a little bit of time into that, just to make sure that you're happy with what you get. So my setup, I'm using PHP as I mentioned, Codeception is my testing framework. Peekov does code coverage for me, and I'll explain some more about that in a bit. And then Ye2 is the PHP framework I'm using. And I started using Ye when it was Ye1, and there's a lot of difference between the two. It was quite painful, the initial switch. And occasionally I have to look at a Ye1 application and my brain just explodes. It's like, oh, you can't do that. But the codeception ties in quite nicely with Ye2. Peekov does the code coverage, so it sits there while your tests are running and has a look and sees, have you tested this bit, have you tested that bit? And in my case, I'm using PHP Storm as my integrated developer environment, and codeception is known by PHP Storm, so I can run a test from in my environment, in my development environment, and it will give me a go, no-go signal. So on your tables, you'll see there's some stickers for various JetBrains products. You'll notice I have some on my laptop. The only way to get stickers from JetBrains is to say, yes, I'd like 50 of them, and I'm going to go and do a talk somewhere. I've been trying to get rid of these for 3 years, so please take some with you, because I think I first got them when I spoke here with Alex before, and as you can see, they're still around. So do grab some. They are free. So there's a bit of discussion about when do you write the tests, and in Nick's talk that he did at Code Hub, he touched on this as well. Do you write them after your code? Now there's a risk there. If you've written them after your code, you might subconsciously be putting some bias in there. I know this will work, so I'll test for it. But equally, if you've got to test it, after the code could be as good a time as any. Equally, you can do it before you've written any code. And test-driven development works this way, where you take your specification, and you look at it and go, okay, so I need these inputs on the screen, I need this output, you write your tests, and then you run them. And no code has been written yet, so they should fail, surely. Well, if they pass, you've got a few options. Either someone else has already written that feature and you just didn't notice. That's your best option. The second option is that you wrote that code and you forgot. Been there as well. Or your test's wrong. Because if you haven't written the code, it shouldn't pass. So, as I say, if it passes, something is wrong. And the advantage of that is that you are definitely going to be testing the outcomes there, because you haven't put a bias in yet. You might, I suppose, write your code in bias to your test. I haven't decided if that's better or worse. Personally, I'm a rebel and I do a bit of both. If I go to write a new feature, I'll sit there and go, oh, what do I fancy today? Sometimes I might even flick a coin, and I'll just pick one. And I guess I'm a bit sad. It can be quite fun seeing all the tests light up green when you do it that way. So here's an example test. Now I've got in my notes here, naming things is hard. So this test is called Prevent Anonymous Creation of Tag. Well, this is a test, it doesn't do that at all. But it checks that an anonymous user can't create a tag, so I probably ought to rename it. Naming stuff is hard. And then we've got 4 lines there. So the first one is just a helper function that I wrote, or possibly my coding partner wrote, one of us wrote. And it will go and change a setting, because the system will fail if you're not allowed to log in locally, because all of these tests run in the local context. So it will enable that, and it saves having to rewrite the same code multiple times in multiple files. And then it will tell codeception, go to the page, tag create. So as far as codeception is concerned in its virtual browser, it's gone there. And then it doesn't want to see the words create tag. Because if you are on that page, at that part of the application, right at the top it says create tag. It's a pretty good indicator that you're in the right place. But because we're not logged in, and everything in this system pretty much requires a login, you don't want to see that. And then it says, I do see Evatabu password. So Evatabu is the system this about, and I did another talk here 3 years ago, must be. It was about Evatabu. And on the login screen, it has that word. And that's partly because the users that I'm dealing with are not the most literate. So at least if I tell them which password they want, they might put that one in. And this can fail at any point. And if it fails, it stops. And it says, I failed here. So if it can't enable the setting for whatever reason, that's it. Game over, test stops. Maybe I've got allow local login spelled wrong or something like that. Maybe just log on. It could also fail at I don't see. But if it fails at I don't see, that means I do see. As we'll come on to in a minute, that could be a problem. And here is the problem. So I was on a development week. As I said, this is not my job, but occasionally I'll take time off of my normal job to do this other job. I'm weird. And I ran these tests, because what had happened was my coding partner had said, oh, you should write some tests, that'd be really good. I thought, oh, just test it by hand. Well, obviously I've learned from that one. And I wrote loads of tests. And I started off with the easy stuff, is this there? And I thought, oh, anonymous access. And I actually copied and pasted the same pretty much test, every single one, edited it, and I ran them. And most of them were fine. This one wasn't. You should not be able to do a tag creation if you are not logged in. I thought, oh, there's a problem there, because this is live on the internet. Alex's reaction, very nice like that. Now, fortunately, we're not exactly a big come and look at us kind of organisation. And we could see that nobody had created a tag, so it's not like anybody took advantage of this. But it did mean that my morning, which was write some tests, became fix that and any others, and then make sure it never happens again. But I wouldn't have known that was possible had I not written some tests. Because, I'll be honest, if I'm testing it by hand, I don't just throw every single link in the address bar and see if it works. Because I'm not penetration testing the application. If I was, it would be a different story. And then code section will actually allow you to look at that test in a bit more detail. Now, I'll caveat this, my system doesn't look like that because that looks pretty rubbish. There's no styling on that, and code section has literally just gone, there's no CSS or JavaScript here, bosh, there you go. So I can validate from its findings, yep, it got to the create tag page. This is a problem. And you could go through and I could change the test and maybe say, well, if you get there, can you type something in and hit create and does it save? So I could have expanded that test quite a lot. And oddly enough, in the logged in version of the test, it does check those things. But as you should never get here, it should be sufficient to know you can't. So I was in a position where I had a bit of an issue. So I had identified a security concern. Now, fortunately, when I did that to make this slide deck, I actually had to go and break the application in dev to go and recreate the thing I fixed 3 years ago. Which meant that I then obviously ran my tests and got the break, which meant that I then had to unbreak it and then run them again, because I'm paranoid now. So my test suite has confirmed that the problem is now fixed again. And as developers, it's our job to make sure that the code that we write is a good quality code. It does what we want, it does it in a safe way, people can't abuse the system that's there. Now, that was just a tag form, so at the end of the day, someone might create some tags with some rude words. Wouldn't be the end of the world. Wouldn't look great, wouldn't be the end of the world. But I can use these tests to also go, right, well, can I get a list of users anonymously? You can't, by the way, that one did work. It's good news. So had the test not been present, I wouldn't have ever found the problem until somebody reported it to me, or I spotted something a bit odd. And the bit odd would probably be that the log showed that somebody had made a test but it didn't know who. Sorry, somebody made a tag, but it didn't know who. So when you write your tests, in the default configuration, at least it was back when I started with this, it would pick up the first file alphabetically, it would run those tests, and then it would pick up the second one, run it. And the problem with that is that you can end up in a position where you require the tests to run in a certain order, and then everything is fine. If they run in a different order, they break. It makes sense. So codeception is configurable to say any order you like, and every time you start, it'll just pick a random order and it will go for it. So I learned to do that, and now I have no idea what order they're going to run in. They just go. So make sure they don't depend on each other. The other thing you can do in some frameworks and with some databases is if you're touching a database that can do something in a transaction, so you can do that thing and if it's okay you can hit save. If your framework supports it, you can say run it in a transaction. So all of a sudden if a test is passed or failed or whatever had happened, it would undo anything in the database. So the next test wouldn't have any of that to go on. So by putting those two in, my tests now don't depend on each other. Because if they did, one of them would fail, and I'd have to go and fix it. So I mentioned PCOV earlier, and this is for code coverage. And what code coverage does is it looks at the number of lines you've got, and it says, okay, you have got a test that touches the code on 12% of your lines of code. I don't know what is an average across the industry. Now you could gamify that, and sometimes it is a bit fun, I said I was sad. to try and up your test percentage. So sometimes I just spend the morning writing some tests just to get the number higher. But if you aim for 100%, you could be on a hiding to nothing, because some of those lines might be really difficult to hit with a test. But ultimately, the client is paying you for features. They don't want you to go, oh, well, there's 3,000 tests for this application. Doesn't really work, though. But the tests are there. They're fine. That's not what we're there for. So you can spend a heck of a lot of time writing tests rather than doing features. But at the same time, it's good to have them, just to give yourself that reassurance. I'm about to push that into production. Is it going to break something? Does it work? Has a new feature come along that's a bit mad? So my starting measurement was like that, which I thought was pretty good, because I hadn't written that many tests. I think my coding partner contributed some tests as well. And I thought 70%, that's not bad. For a little project with one part-time dev, one very, very part-time dev, that's not bad at all. And then I thought, right, well, what else can I do here? And we can see in here, you can't see the colours so well, but controls and models, they're yellow, so the test percentage isn't in what code section considers high. But views and widgets, their percentage is high. I don't tend to worry about the stuff at the other end, the functions, methods, classes and traits, because I haven't got that far yet. I'm interested in the lines at the moment. I can cope with that measurement. So I reran it. Now you'll see there's some different directories in here. Some stuff's gone, some other stuff's arrived. The important thing for me is modules, 0%. And I highlight modules because we had an issue. I made a change. I hadn't got a test for it, but there's a third-party system that integrates with this one. Just gets some data occasionally. It had been broken for about 2 months. None of us had noticed. Nobody had actually gone in the other system to see that nothing had happened. Had I had a test in there, it would have gone, by the way, that change you've just made has just broken the sync with this other system. So clearly there's a need for some work on that. But like I say, don't try and gamify it all the time. It's occasionally fun, if you're like me, but you could waste a lot of time and not get any new features. Mutation tests, I've barely started touching these. But what happens is, you've got your test, and if it works, you can use a mutation tool to say, okay, I'm going to go and change the code now. So it's not changing a test, it's changing a code. And say you've got a check that says a number must be greater than 17. Say it's an age field, you want adults only. So as it stands, the test passes. So the mutation tool will go and change your code. Maybe it will say, I want equals 17, and then it will run your test again. If the test still passes, you have what it terms an escaped mutant, which sounds kind of cool. Because that shouldn't work. If your test was right, changing that code should have broken the test. When I first ran this, I had all sorts of escape mutants and sat there scratching my head. I vowed to go back to it some way, and haven't yet got that far. So it's quite interesting from an academic perspective. If you're one of those people that likes reading academic papers, the academic reading of mutation tests is quite fascinating. But it is useful in improving your test writing, because if you find there's an escaped mutant, it also says in the documentation you need to kill the escaped mutant. It's very violent mutation testing. So you go and improve your test, you run it again, hopefully you end up with a dead mutant. So in conclusion, using a test framework will save you time. If I had to test all of my application by hand every single time, I could probably write off a day's development work just for that. It'll give you confidence that your recent changes haven't broken something that you didn't work on, that perhaps you thought was unrelated and forgot. But don't forget, that will only be the case if you've tested the right thing in the first place. So you do have to think these through. But also, from a security person's perspective and as an auditor, if you've got some tests, it's quite reassuring to be able to go, yeah, actually we tested for that, or we've tested that you can't log in access stuff anonymously, because you can present that to an auditor and they'll see that actually, as a developer or as a group of developers, you've got quite a mature approach to writing your code, which is really important when somebody wants to make sure that they maybe want to insure you. So Dave mentioned cyber insurance. I don't know how many cyber insurers sit there and go, what's your code really like? I suspect they don't come in and look at it line by line, but they might want some reassurance. Actually, you're at least trying. Equally, your investors probably want some reassurance that you're not going to go and push a feature that breaks everything in one go. So there we go, testing. I would recommend it to you. That's it. Any questions? But bear in mind, I'm not an expert. Alex.
So obviously you probably know that I'm a PHP dev. So I'm just wondering, so you said that, I made a note, PHP stat and code section there, designed for PHP. I was just wondering, how long would it take to sort of get your head around the testing framework if you had never used any before?
So code section is very easy to get your head into, and you saw the language that it used, so it makes sense, and the documentation is really pretty good for code section.
What, could you do in like a day?
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay, cool.
I mean, you're not obviously going to know all of code section in a day, but you would be able to get to a point where you could test a good amount of your application, and it would be giving you useful and meaningful results.
Okay, what about PHP stan?
PHP stan basically looks at a list of rules that it has, and will go, okay, well, does this function ever return? Has it disappeared? Did you delete something? So once you've put it in and told it, my code is here and run to this level, it's fairly good.
Okay.
And you can just hit go. And again, you can do that in less than a day.
Cool.
But depending on what level you tell PHP stan to run at, it'll either give you really nitpicky things or stuff that you care about. And my advice would be to start with the stuff that you care about more, like this function doesn't exist, why are you calling it? And then work your way up. Everyone's quiet. That's good, I like quiet. Uh-oh. Alex, and I'll go on.
Have you looked at using spies or mocks in any of your tests yet?
Spies or
Mocks.
I haven't, but I'm intrigued by the name.
It might speed up your database. Any tests are using the integrated touching the database. Effectively, you mock in dependencies, so your database interaction, and then you don't have to run any of your tests in a transaction.
Okay, cool. I'll look at that. Thank you very much. Somebody else had a hand up. You had a hand up over there.
So we've got a number of applications that all talk to each other, and it's very important that they talk to each other properly. And we've all developed them in-house. And I get that you can have an testing for each individual application, but I wonder, is there a testing framework that can kind of sit above that, that's kind of framework or language agnostic? So it's something like, I think there was something called Selenium, which is like open up like Chromium or something.
Yeah, I'll control your browser.
But we've got applications that range from like, C# to a PHP backend to a JavaScript front end, even like Electron. And all of them, like I say, it's very important they all work. So just wondered if there's anything, maybe not to cover all of those things, but rather than individually, something that could act as almost like a person clicking around, on screen. But it's one thing we're really struggling with at the moment because there's a lot out there. So.
Glenn's got a hand up, and I think he wants to answer, and I'll take that lifeline.
So this is a common challenge in software testing. What I usually is to make sure that they look at, so you've got lots of different components that all talk to each other, is to make sure those components are cohesive. In other words, they have a particular function, test that. In terms of the connectivity or working together, you should be able to mock something which that's what I'm saying here. You should be able to mock this item that we produce to see if this one works, if this works. But you should try and keep your tests cohesive to the actual component itself. Because if you start doing tests across multiple components, then you start getting into a real messy situation.
Yeah, relying on versions being exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So I think cohesion and loose coupling are two very important parts of that and keep testing.
So one thing I did at a previous company was something called like consumer-driven contracts. So CDC. So essentially, like each application that depends on another application, that gives you sort of like the contract that they expect. And then, but you include that contract in the tests for that one application. So any change you make, you're testing that all the things that depend on, you're still fulfilling the contract you've agreed to, essentially for those other applications.
The contract in the other test depend on the contract.
Yeah.
So what the contract.
On top of that, what you have is like integration tests, like they're talking, and on top of that, you want to make sure that everything works end to end, not having a have like a shit ton of unit tests, serious amount of integration tests, and then one or two end-to-end tests to make sure everything is working. With Selenium, if you like.
So I don't know, but they do. Are we all happy? Do we just want to eat pizza and drink beer?
I'm a tester, I'm not a developer, so thank you for being a developer that does testing. And I'm quite interested in the coverage from the point of view of a developer, right? So can you have, like, is actually coverage measurement of quality in the code? Because I can think that you can have a test for everything, and things like, I want to test if my table is blue, but my test says, does it have four legs and passes? So is it 100% coverage? It doesn't mean anything.
It means that you've got a test that touches 100% of lines. I wouldn't say it was an indicator of coverage, because you could write some really rubbish code, and I probably have written some really rubbish code. If the test says it passes, it just means that it works.
In theory, you can write a test that runs every line of your code and doesn't assert it. So, or you can one asserting it's true is true, and you go, I've run all my code. That's where mutation comes in. The mutation, by changing your code, check that your tests are testing something valuable rather than just asserting just running through.
So it doesn't really mean anything. Well, it means that someone cared a little bit, but not necessarily all right.
You've run all your code, so we're going through a lot of version upgrades of PHP, so having 100% coverage, you can make sure every line runs, that you haven't got any problems.
But the danger, of course, is if you try to go for 100% coverage, you end up testing the framework itself. And you don't want to do that either, because that's always
You can exclude parts of the framework.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you know, every line of code, if you're testing every line of code, 100% coverage of lines of code, as you're saying, the danger there, of course, is that you could be testing, just a simple function in terms of a single variable, zero input, and that's not going to benefit anything, because that's just a run framework doing that correctly. You'd expect that the framework being tested by their developers. But it's interesting that you said that code coverage based on functions and methods, you weren't very interested in that. I would say that's probably the most important bit.
At the moment, my brain won't let me get there. So, yeah, it probably is. But at the moment, I can cover these. That's nice colours.
Because that means that there's touch points with your code, and that's probably what's going to give you the best coverage of the functionality of your application.
I need to go and read up about the other side.
We had 80% code coverage, and we were quite happy with that until somebody said, well, there's 20% that's uncovered. What is the 20%? Is that important? And then we're like, oh yeah. So
Was it
then we went
important?
back, and we did get up to 100%, but it's painful. But once you're there, so
Sorry about that.
Oh, was it his fault? Excellent.
yeah. But actually, nobody got it 100% at that point. It was only when you quizzed us and said.
So how much dev time was lost to features because you did the extra 20%?
Actually, it wasn't that bad.
Okay, cool.
It really wasn't that painful, because actually, if you have that mindset and you also look through your testing code as you do it, you're not only improving the quality of your tests, but you're improving the quality of the test code at the same time. So actually, we found that refactoring the tests brought it up by 5% already, and it just went on from there. So actually, probably in time, it probably took 4 weeks, 6 weeks. I can't remember now. It's a long time ago. But now we've got a pipeline where we just can't go unless it's 100% code coverage. It won't go. So.
I'm not going to get to 100 anytime soon, I'm sure.
It's having that mindset from the start though. If you're starting a new project, I would never in a million years start a new project now unless I start with tests, and then you've got that consistency going forward.
Conversely, if you haven't got the luxury of starting with something new, a lot of people ask me how to start. I think the best way to start is whenever you're making changes to your code, is then to write tests first. And think about how you can decouple dependencies as well, because that's going to make your code cleaner.
And focus on the things that are the most important. You know,
Don't start like from, you know, the very first class you come to and say, right, I'm going to do
No,
this.
no,
That's not going to work. So start with what you're changing. That's more
Start with order processing, not, you know, like buttons, that sort of thing. Get your priorities right, but it's worth the pain.
So I have a general question, not necessarily to you, but like for the people here that are working in like doing testing as developers, do your companies have also testers doing testing on top of that?
Yeah. No. I feel all tests written by engineers. I don't think there's any specific testing roles. There's security roles, but all of our tests are written by engineers, and we've just got 100% code coverage.
We have manual testers that test the integrations because we're service-based. So we have the solution testing, like the final ending solution, but we also have testers who write automated acceptance tests for the critical paths. So like you were talking about the overall, like it's a critical path. So buying a vehicle online, it goes from the beginning of selecting a vehicle, going through the whole purchase journey to the final payment.
Yeah.
But if I can get A to B, that's kind of it works. All the intricacies of every different payment provider, I think we don't tend to test just that long piece. And then, like you were saying about how it looks, because actually there's quite a lot of visual and a lot of UX to it, which is part of that testing that isn't really covered in automation.
If you're dealing with API sets, it's not important. Like, you can cover all the automated tests, really don't need, but front end stuff definitely don't need. There's nothing that will really supersede a tester looking over it.
Yeah, because I'm wondering with artificial intelligence going on, like you rely on something like learning by themselves, it's not controlled by you, so who says who's right or not? Is that something that you're not controlling? Or maybe I'm just wondering for how long I will do it, how much?